right. While horticulturalists may still be in that transitional phase, eventually, as their horticulture becomes more developed, they will settle down and become sedentary. That's sedentary, sedentary. Hunter-gatherers, as you may recall, have a nomadic lifestyle, and that we already talked about at some length. They're moving around continually. That was spoken about in both of the readings that were assigned for this section. Intensive agriculturalists always have a sedentary lifestyle from the start. Presumably they've gone through a phase of horticulture, and in order to maintain horticulture in any kind of effective way, you have to become more and more sedentary. That is, you have to stay closer to your garden, you have to tend your crops. If anybody's had a backyard garden, they understand all kinds of things can go wrong with your garden. Right? There are pests that can eat it. You got to watch those. You got to watch for animals that'll get into it, in addition to the insect pests. I was thinking of insects. There are diseases that can crop up in your garden. You want to isolate things that are affected so they don't infect everything else. You have to water the gardens. Excuse me. There are all kinds of things that can go wrong with your garden. Other people can steal your stuff from your garden. Right? So there are huge benefits to becoming more sedentary as you rely more on controlled food supply in the form of a garden. Intensive agriculture. Intensive agriculture includes basically all of the modern technology. We could break this up into different types of intensive agriculture, but we don't really need to go that far in this case. For our purposes, basically anything more complicated than simple hand tools falls into the category of intensive agriculture. Some of the things that characterized it early on particularly, and still are used today, listed off to the right-hand side here. Irrigation, which is a system in which you bring water from wherever the water is to wherever your crops are. This can have the effect of making non-arable land into arable land. That's A-R-A-B-L-E, arable, which means that it's land that can be planted. Arable land can be planted. So you can change non-arable land, because it doesn't have enough water, into arable land by importing the water through irrigation. Right. Crop rotation is another thing you might have heard of, maybe in a social studies class at some point. And there are 3 and 4 field crop rotation systems, and in those systems you have multiple fields. Multiple fields, and you'll rotate the crops. Literally, plant different crops in different fields, and rotate them every season, right? At least every season. If you have a 3-field system, the idea is that you take some crops take things out of the soil, and other crops put things back into the soil, and so if you rotate them through it, you get more life out of the soil. If you have a 4-field system, you may let one field lay fallow, F-A-L-L-O-W, that's what they call it, when you don't plant in a field for a season. Right? You let it recover, let nature take it over, and then the next season you can, or maybe even 2 seasons later, you can plow it again and plant it. And crop rotation allows you to get a lot more longevity and productivity over a long term from the land that you have. Right? So you don't have to depend on moving around. If you remember swidden cultivation, we talked about in the horticulture section, people just basically moved from one place to another. They cut down a piece of forest, plant there, burn it, plant there, and then they'd cut down another piece of forest somewhere else. Right? This doesn't require you to move around as much. You can have control over a set number of fields and just rotate crops through them and prolong the life of the soil. Another thing that's associated with intensive agriculture is the use of animal power, animal-driven plows, for example. Animals provide all kinds of things. Obviously, you can use them for more than just plows. You can use them to transport things. You can use them to turn grist mills, all kinds of stuff. And of course, they produce fertilizer as well. And that's something that's associated with intensive agriculture. Horticulturalists generally don't use fertilizer unless it's naturally occurring in the area that they're in, as in the example of the leaf litter among the Wairani. That adds organic material to the soil, much in the way a fertilizer might, but it's a naturally occurring thing. In this case, using the animals, they're going to produce fertilizer anyway. What we see to the left of this is an illustration of something called terrace farming. T-E-R-R-A-C-E, terrace farming. And basically what's happened there is they've converted non-arable land in the form of a mountainside, and there are many reasons you can't plant on a mountainside, not the least of which is the first time it rains, it's probably going to wash everything down the mountainside. It's also inconvenient to get to. So what they did was they carved stair steps in the side of territory that's too steep for them to normally plant in. So you can see the stair steps going down. This is rice cultivation, and that's why they've used irrigation. Almost everything in the column to the left, or to the right, is demonstrated in the column to the left, with the exception of crop rotation. You can see they've used irrigation to pump water down through the terraces. You can see that he's using an animal-driven plow, so clearly not horticulture, apart from the terracing, and it is a fairly complex form of agriculture. It's obviously intensive agriculture. So he's using animal-driven plows, and presumably those animals are leaving fertilizer as they go. So it's a nice picture to illustrate a bunch of different elements at the same time that are associated with intensive agriculture. Excuse me. We could say that intensive agriculture supports the highest density of life of any of the strategies that we've talked about so far, so it has the highest carrying capacity. We already talked about the fact that it necessitates sedentary life. People have to stay in one place in order to do it. As you can see, again, in the example of the terrace farming, if you spend all the time and energy to carve out the side of a mountain so that you could plant better, you're probably going to stick around. You're not going to be nomadic and wandering off and letting other people take control of it. Alright, so intensive agriculture. We've got a short video on that too, which I'm posting separately. You can have a look at that afterwards, or after you finish this video. Well, no, there are a few more things that I should probably say about it before I move on to that. We talked about sedentary, obviously talk about the movement to sedentary life. They also talk about generating a surplus, which is something that is, we'll talk about writing in a second here. In the video they also talk about generating a surplus, which is generating more than you actually need to survive. Subsistence farming is generating just enough to keep your group alive. When you generate a surplus, though, then it introduces more complex economic functions like market exchange. Market exchange is exchange based on supply and demand, and the video talks a little bit about those markets. You can see some of them in action. Eventually they develop monetary systems, which is something I don't think we've touched on that yet. We talk about it in the economic section, obviously, which is coming up next. Monetary system is a system in which you use money to abstract the value of something from the thing itself. Right? There's a distinction between use value and exchange value. It comes out of Marxist theory. Those are fairly simple concepts to understand. The use value of an item is what you can actually do with it. The exchange value is what you can get for it by exchanging it. Those aren't necessarily the same. Excuse me. If you have an iPhone, for example, you can only use one iPhone at a time. So you only really need one iPhone. But if somebody gives you, and that's the use value, right? The use value of the iPhone is that you can use it to do all these things. So you can only use one at a time. If somebody gave you a crate of iPhones, though, then you'd take them because you understand the concept of exchange value. You're not going to get use value out of a whole crate of them, but you can sell them, right? And you can get the value from those things without actually having the things. This is what a monetary system does for you, right? It gives you the ability to abstract the value of the thing from its use value, right? So we can take that in money, and we don't have to actually have the things, the commodities. Right. So generally, monetary systems are associated with the development of surpluses and then markets. Another thing that is associated with the development of surpluses, and is very important, is specialized labor. So that's something we're going to talk about in the next section as well. Specialized labor is any work that's done that is not directly related to subsistence. So in other words, for example, if we go back about 150 years in the United States, 95% of the people were producing food, shelter, clothing, things we need to survive. Right? It was a largely agrarian society in the U.S., also around the world. If we look at the numbers today, it's reversed. Right? Less than 5%, more like 2 or 3%, I think, at this point, of people are actually involved in subsistence production. The rest of them are involved in specialized labor that's not directly related to production of food, clothing, and shelter. Excuse me. So specialized labor is an important concept and leads to a lot of different things, which we'll talk about more when we get to Jared Diamond. This slide in front of us is on the emergence of writing, and I wanted to point out that this came in conjunction with the transition to intensive agriculture. It was actually the result of a student's question in a class that I held previously, and it just is the graphic shows the origin points of written language. It's not a language; people had languages long before they wrote them down, but this is about the emergence of written language. And I wanted to point out that there have only been 5 different independent innovations of written language in the world. Right. They're listed off to the left here, and you can see where they're located and examples of them on the right. The oldest one that we're aware of is East Asia, and I think there's very little evidence of that, but there is a little that goes back to 8600 BP. BP stands for before present. I believe that's a come across yet. Present was defined arbitrarily, I guess, as 1950. So they did this like in the 40s, I guess. In any case, it's quite a long time ago. 8600 BP. They were switching from the BC AD model. They still use AD, though. I don't know why. In any case, that's the oldest one, and that was that arose in association with rice cultivation in the Far East. Right, so you can see that each one of these written language types developed in conjunction with intensive agriculture, the earliest sites of intensive agriculture. In the Far East, they developed a rice culture. In Mesopotamia, that's in the Middle East, and they developed a cuneiform language, or written language there. They also developed wheat and other grains, which supported a more dense population, led to the development of written language. In Egypt, they had a similar agricultural complex that they had to what they had in the Middle East. They had a very different language that developed. South Asia, the Indian subcontinent, another form of written language developed, and also another independent form of rice cultivation, about 4,000 BP. Mesoamerica was probably the latest one, but it was also an independent innovation of language in Middle America, Central America. And that was the Mayan language, and you can see an example of their ideograms here. So the point is, we didn't really have a need to write things down until we had surpluses and dense populations. First things that were actually written down, you might think that people decided to write down stories and books and things like that, but the very first things that were actually written down, as far as we know, were actually ledgers. People keeping track of that surplus that they were producing. The next things that they wrote down were the stories, particularly the stories of religion and monarchs or leaders, and usually those were closely intertwined. Many people around the world, you may have heard of something called the divine right of kings in Western culture. It was the idea that the king was anointed by God, and that is where that person got their power. That's an idea that's common around the world. So religious stories often were also the stories of their leaders. Right? So that was their political stories, in other words. So first thing that people wrote down was ledgers. They had to keep track of the surplus that they were producing and where it went and how much people made. Presumably, once a monetary system was developed, they had to keep track of that. Second thing they wrote down, politics and entertainment. Right. So that's the bit about writing. Again, that came from a student question. It was interesting. All right, I'm going to stop there for this section, and I'm going to do a separate short section on the Jared Diamond piece.